hate the thought that I'm on TV. Hi, thank you for coming. It's good to see you this afternoon. As most of you know, we'll be doing Chapter 2 this afternoon. Chapter 2 is really devoted to the partnerships and the procedures and the steps we take in order to deliver educational services to children with disabilities. And sometimes we do this in inclusive settings, which is primarily what we talk about in here, the inclusive strategies that are necessary to make education effective for children with disabilities. But also, as most of you know, children are frequently referred to special education for special education, and they're diagnosed, assessed, and deemed to have a disability of one sort or another. And if this is the case, they are likely to receive at least part of their instructional services in a special ed classroom or some other special ed intervention facility. So I think it's important for us to spend a little bit of time thinking and really focusing our thoughts on whether or not it is really justified to assign a label to a student who has a disability. And whether or not that the end of labeling a student really justifies the means of providing services for that student under that rubric. And primarily, in addition to that, why do you think we need labels anyway? Why is it, do you think, that we have to give a kid a label? Yes.
So we can provide them with what they need?
Well, what is it about the provision of services that requires a label? Say you have a child who, you're a second grade teacher. Anybody going to be a second grade teacher? All right, we have a couple of second grade teachers in here. And in your second grade classroom, you might find a child that you've noticed has fallen behind in reading. Could you buy that? Believe me, you can make book on it. It's going to happen. There will be several children in a second grade classroom who are behind grade level in reading. So what you know about this child already is that he doesn't know the reading vocabulary words. He doesn't have good word attack skills. He doesn't have the sound symbol association for many of the letters of the alphabet. So if we referred this child and tested him and found that he needed to go to special education, what do you think his label would be? How do you think he would come back from that referral process?
Just a regular kid that needs a little help.
He'd come back a regular kid who couldn't keep up in the general ed classroom with reading because he didn't know the vocabulary words and didn't have the phonics skills and probably didn't have very good word attack skills. He'd come back the same kid, but he'd come back, that kid, with a label. What do you think that label would be?
Learning disabled.
In all probability, with this case scenario, he would come back as a learning disability or a reading disability student. Now, what do you know about the child now that you know he has a reading disability, and we've assigned that even a learning disability label, which is really the technical IDEA term that he would get? What do we know about him that we didn't know before that's going to help you teach him reading tomorrow? Probably not very much. He still needs word attack skills. He still needs phonics skills. He still needs to know the sound symbol association with the letters of the alphabet. So why do you think we give them these labels?
To differentiate the disability?
Well, I think we started out that way. We'll talk a little bit about differential diagnosis next time when we talk about mild to moderately disabled kids as opposed to those with more severe labels. I think there are some labels that do communicate a great deal to us about the nature of the child's disability and what potential outcomes we can expect. For example, if I told you a child had Down syndrome, that would mean a very specific set of things to you, wouldn't it? But if I tell you a child has a learning disability, You don't even know if he can't read or can't do math, do you? Or maybe something else entirely. But nevertheless, we have to have this label to provide services. What do you think is at the bottom of all that? Why do you think we have to have that label?
Money.
Money. It always boils down to money, doesn't it, honey? Right. We started special education many years ago with a system that requires districts to certify children with disabilities as having this disability or that disability or the other disability in order to receive flow-through funds to the school to provide services for that student. Now, if it all stopped right there, that'd be okay, wouldn't it? Just assign a few labels, get a bunch of money, and everything's hunky-dory, isn't it? The problem with that system is that there are little kids running around with these labels on them. So, I'm going to tell you right now that I know what it takes to get through 3360. Because I've been teaching this class for a long time. So, today I brought with me a test. And I'm going to pass my test out, and I'm going to see how smart y'all are. And if you're real smart, I'm going to let you be a peer tutor. How many of you would be willing to help somebody in the class that was having trouble keeping up? Just about everybody would probably be willing to help a friend or a colleague that was having trouble studying, right? You all study in groups and help one another all the time, don't you? So that wouldn't be a big effort on your part, would it? Who's real smart and thinks they're going to be the tutor? Nobody in here's real smart? Huh?
That's why we're taking this class, so we can become real smart.
So you can learn more. Well, my test will tell me who's real smart anyway, but my test is also going to tell me who is not quite as smart and who's likely to have difficulty passing my test and completing Kim's assignments and earning an A in here. That'd be a good idea, wouldn't it? Who wants to take my test?
It helps me get an A.
Brianna's going to sign up. She's after that A. I probably wouldn't have very many takers, would I? Actually, I started telling you all last week what Dr. Lieberman and I used to do. We used to actually pass out a test. I'm not as mean as I used to be. I've gotten soft in my old age, you see. But we used to have this class in the Kiva long before there was ever distance ed, and we would pass out these bogus tests, and they were so hard, nobody knew the answer to anything. And all those of you who sit there not holding up your hand thinking I'm really real smart, but I'm not going to hold up my hand because I don't want to appear to be immodest, thought when I started passing out the test, oh, there's nothing to this. But then we said only 10% of the class were going to be identified as the stars of the class who were going to be eligible to serve as tutors. And when we came back next week, those would be identified and they would sit in the top row. And then we would also identify the 25% who would be at the lower end of the class and who were likely to fail the class. And we were going to let each peer tutor work with 2 or 3 of the slow students to help them keep up. What do you think those students did? Well, they had some very bizarre reactions. How many people do you think came to class the next week? I mean, we took up the papers, you understand. We never told them a word. Some of them were furious, but very few of them came back, and of those who came back, about half of them were scared to death, and about half of them were so mad I could hardly stand to stay in the kiva with them. Because really and truly, even if it meant extra help for them, they didn't want to be the ones who were identified as being somehow not quite as equal, as cognitively equal as their peers. And it led me to this inescapable conclusion about labels. It's easy for those of us who assign labels say, oh, well, this label doesn't mean anything. It will just give you the provision of services you need. We want to help you. We want to help you do better. That's easy for us to say when we're the ones who are assigning the labels. But when you're the one who has to wear the label, it becomes a different story. So labels are really the best when you don't have to wear one. Would you agree with that? Well, pretty soon you're going to be in a position of, as a classroom teacher, of making a decision about whether many children need a label to receive educational services to meet their educational needs and goals, or whether you go the extra mile to accommodate them in your classroom and allow them to get what they need without a public announcement that they're not just as quite as okay as everybody else when it comes to having their educational needs met. And I want you to think about that, because as a general ed teacher, which all but one of you are going to be if my memory serves me, you will be the ones who make that decision about whether and when and if you will refer a student for special education, or whether you will try to accommodate their needs in your classroom and make special ed referral a last-ditch effort. And of course, our whole purpose of our class is to motivate you to do otherwise and to equip you with a set of skills so it won't be necessary for you to refer all students for a special ed label who are a little bit behind in mainstream general ed classes. Now then, the law is very specific in detailing what the schools and the parents' responsibilities are when it comes to IDEA. IDEA provides the legal rights for individuals with disabilities, as we talked about before, to receive an appropriate education, to have collaboration and constructive partnerships with regular ed parents and regular ed classrooms and regular ed schools. And it comes also with the added responsibility to make certain that you carry out not only the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law, to make certain that this system works the way it's supposed to work. Now, according to the law, the school is responsible for providing a free and appropriate education for all students through age 21. The original iteration of IDEA called for services for children from ages 3 to 21. Later, about 15 or 20 years later, we added a revision to that bill that provided services for children aged 0 to 21. Did we talk about that yesterday, last week, and the gap between children as they age, how the gap enhances? Early childhood services are necessary for children with a whole range of developmental disabilities to see that early intervention closes that gap and that they don't lose ground as they mature, when we can intervene with appropriate services and help them catch up with kids their own age. The school is responsible for providing an individual educational program for each student who requires special educational related services, and there are many components to that IEP, and we'll talk about those and what some of them are as the time goes by. The school is legally required to provide appropriate testing. All evaluations are done at no charge to the parents, and the tests selected in the interpretation of the test results have to be done on a non-biased basis. So we have to have tests that are appropriate for evaluating the problem at hand, and they have to be as culture biased, unbiased and as linguistically unbiased as possible, meaning that if a student's native language is not English or that student is not reaching a native-like fluency in English, the student is administered the test in a language that he or she can understand. We're obligated to educate students in the least restrictive educational environment. What this means is not that all students have to be placed in the general ed classroom. It doesn't mean that at all. But what it does mean is that you can't just segregate children with disabilities at your convenience if you're a school district. In other words, you can't say to a parent, we would like to put your student in a general ed classroom, and that would certainly be appropriate for him or her, but that would require us providing a paraprofessional, and that's too expensive. So we're going to put them over here in a classroom for children who are mentally retarded or whatever. Do you see what I'm saying? So we don't have to put every child in a general ed classroom, but we have to put every child in the educational environment that is the least restrictive for him and in which he can be a productive member. We have to assure confidentiality of records for all individuals with disabilities. Some of you may know, just based on being a college student, how secure it is necessary to maintain student records. Many years ago, we posted all grades by Social Security number. We returned all student papers in central locations, central housing units, so to speak. So we'd put all the 3360 papers in a box and let you go pick up your own. But of course, we don't do those kinds of things anymore because we consider them to be a violation of privacy for other students to be able to look at your paper and see what you made or know your Social Security number, or to have your husband or your parents come up here and look at your grade and see what your grade was. I must say it galls most parents that pay for their students' education not to be able to get their grades. I found that very offensive myself, but nevertheless, it is part of our right to privacy law, and certainly we have those same things that are in place for people with disabilities to make certain that we are very private and maintain confidentiality when handling any educational matter related to them. Another element of IDEA is that we not only provide services for students with disabilities, we seek to find students within the community and throughout the states that are not in an appropriate educational placement. I may have mentioned to you last time that when IDEA was initially passed as Public Law 94-142, there was an estimated 6 million children who were at home, who had never been to school and never had an educational intervention of any kind. And so they were just basically in custodial care in homes or institutions. And so it's the school's obligation not only to educate children, but to help identify and find them and make certain that their parents know that services are available to them. we have procedural rights for parents and students, and we'll talk about due process more as time goes on. But if education is really going to be a collaborative matter, we have to make sure that parents assume their responsibilities as well. And you will find when you start working in the school, we have parents that are on a continuum from here to here. Some of them are very concerned, very involved, and almost adversarial in their relationships with the schools, and others who are only tangentially involved. They may feel disempowered by schools. One of the things that's very difficult, I think, for teachers and all teachers to understand is that you are, by definition, a population of individuals who have learned to make the educational system work for you. Why do I say that? How do I know that? I can say it without reservation. People in this classroom are people who have made the American educational system work for them, regardless of your gender, ethnicity, age, ability, disability, whatever. I know that you have. How can I say that for sure?
Number of students enrolled in college.
You're in college, for crying out loud. By virtue of your membership in a 4-year institution of higher education, somewhere along the line you learned to make the system work for you. You didn't drop out, you didn't flunk out, you didn't quit. Some of you could probably tell me horror stories. You failed first grade, the teacher was mean to you, all kinds of things that happened to you or your brothers or your sisters. I used to ask students to tell me those things, but I could never get through it without crying myself, so I quit asking those things. It breaks my heart to hear stories about children who have such terrible memories of school, and some of you might have those memories, but despite those memories or those events in your life, all of you have learned to make the American educational system work for you. So you're going to be very careful in advocating for your children. I know that you will. How many of you have children? Boy, you're not scared to go up there, are you? No, ma'am. You're not scared to go up there, are you? These front row sitters, they're never scared. We're not scared of school. We realize what power we have as parents because we were successful at school. What if you didn't have a green card? And we're afraid if you went to school, you might be deported. What if school was such a miserable experience for you that you quit going when you were in the 14 years old? You probably would not perceive that you would be very effective at advocating for your child, would you? Or you might not realize the value education has in helping individuals to meet their needs, because it didn't help you meet any of your needs if you dropped out when you were 14. You might be more encouraged to help your child get a job because that might have been what was successful and effective for you as a coping strategy, right? So all parents are not effective advocates for their children, even though they may care as deeply for their children as you do. But you won't be intimidated by the school because you were a success at school. Not only that, you're going to work in the institution. I knew how to manipulate every rule in the school where my kids were concerned, and did. You do shameful things when you're taking up for your kids. I'm kind of proud of mine, but they're shameful anyway. But I certainly knew how to find the best teacher in a roundabout way and get program requirements changed if they weren't fair and equitable for my children, to ensure that my children were competing on a level playing field. I knew how, and had the good sense to never tell them I was on the faculty at the University of Houston. But I knew the system and I knew how to work it because I'd been good at it. My mother was a teacher and she was good at it. So don't be too quick to judge parents who don't come to IEP meetings or parent conference meetings and those kinds of things. Don't be a teacher who, how many of you have heard, the parents that need to be here never come? How many of you have heard that? I swear if I hear you say it, I'll reach up and smite you a good one. All parents don't have the same history and relationship and sense of empowerment with schools that you do. One of the big problems we have in schools is the people who run them think they work because they work for them. Probably how many of you think schools worked pretty good for you? Nobody? Yeah, you liars. I know better. It worked good for me too. I went and paid a little bit of attention and caught on and did the bare minimum to get by and scooted on to the next grade. And Mama packed me up and sent me off to college, probably glad to get rid of me. And I'm sure Pecos High School was glad to get rid of me. But I'd have to say school worked pretty well for me. In fact, it worked so well I never quit going. I stayed till I had run out of things to study. Then I came back so I could inflict my fate on you all. In any event, parents certainly have a responsibility in this situation. But don't be quick to judge them if they do not exhibit their parental rights and responsibilities in this case in the same way that you might. Certainly we expect and want to encourage parents to cooperate with us as teachers and as administrators of schools. We want them to attend the annual case conference committee meetings, and the law requires us to invite them to attend and schedule the meetings at a time that they can attend and inform them about the times and dates of the meetings in their native language. We want to help them, particularly with children with more moderate to severe disabilities, to implement intervention programs at home. The consistency of home school management is such an important thing. For example, we have children who are moderate to severely impaired all the time who don't have self-help skills like feeding and toileting. We bring those children to school, we teach them how to feed themselves, we teach them how to toilet themselves, but what if they go home and their parents do that for them? Nothing you teach a child in school is ever worth anything unless it's exhibited in a normalized setting. Could you imagine if you had gone to the first grade, your teacher taught you how to read, by about the second or third grade you were an independent reader, you went to school every day, you read up a storm, you graduated from high school, closed the book, never read anything else. Not a newspaper, not a library book, nothing. Not the directions on a bottle of aspirin. How valuable would it be for you to read? Not very, right? Nobody ever taught you to read the directions on an aspirin bottle, did they? Or to read a newspaper, maybe a library book. They were trying to keep you quiet. You figured out if you could read that you could read the directions on an aspirin bottle, right? But children with more moderate to severe disabilities don't figure out those things. We have to teach them to do those things. It's hard to teach your own children to do things, isn't it? So I'd say it's all. I have a friend who actually was in the travel industry, but had nothing to do with teachers or teacher education. Probably one of the only people I know my age that doesn't have a teaching certificate. When I went to college, all girls either were teachers or nurses. But anyway, LB was different. She wasn't a teacher or nurse, either one. She was a journalist or something else. And she ended up in the travel industry. And I can remember when my children were little, I taught swimming at River Oaks Country Club, and I had 2 children who weren't even afraid of the water, and I couldn't teach them to swim. And I just wanted to, bang my head against the wall. And I remember I complaining about this to my friend who knew nothing about education or teaching or anything else. She said, "I thought you had a degree in educational psychology." And I wrung my hands. I said, "There's no application for educational psychology in the home." And I felt that way because it's hard to teach your own children something, isn't it? So oftentimes, parents of children with disabilities, it's easier to feed them, it's easier to toilet them than it is to try to get them to exhibit these independent living skills on their own. And so the children come to school and they're required to be responsible and take care of themselves, and so they exhibit these skills, and then pretty soon they go home and guess what? Mama sits them down at the table and feeds them. So oftentimes we need to have an interface between home and school programs so that we are helping parents implement interventions in the home that will make certain that our child doesn't quit reading in the 4th grade and never read the directions on the aspirin bottle, so to speak. But of course, with children with disabilities, these are in regards to their independent and self-help and independent living skills. So parents have a responsibility to work with the schools to help children generalize these behaviors to normalized settings, because if the gains they make at school don't generalize to normalized settings, it isn't very worthwhile to teach them these things anyway. And certainly it is the parental responsibility to assume their role in participation, communication, and just keeping an open flow between the home, the school, and other environments. And this process in education we really refer to as collaboration. We use the collaboration or the joint efforts of the parents, the teachers, and the school to determine what students' needs are, what school specialists are going to be involved, what teachers, parents, siblings, guardians, who in a child's microcosm may be important in sitting down to help determine what the child's needs are and how these needs can best be met. We refer to this as shared goals. We want all personnel and all members of a child's microcosm to really be involved in determining what the needs are and designing a service delivery model for students with disabilities that help them to accomplish the goals that we have specified for them on IEPs, and making certain that they're meeting the short-term instructional objectives that will lead them to making progress and attaining long-term goals. One of the reasons we have IEPs for kids is because we began to notice that teacher A would have the child, the 1st grade teacher would have the child, and it would take a long time to figure out where the child was, what he could do, what he couldn't do, what he needed. Then teach him just a little bit, and then send him on to the next teacher who would spend half of the year figuring out where he was and what he needed. So by the IEP process, we're able to say where a child is, formulate instructional objectives that will move that student forward, and then communicate that information to other people who will be working with them, so everybody is not reinventing the wheel where a child's education is concerned. And for this collaborative process to take place, we really have to have effective communication. It is sometimes difficult as a teacher to communicate effectively with parents. Sometimes by the time we encounter parents, we're already frustrated in working with the child. Particularly, this is the case if children's problem is misbehavior. If they're acting out, we think as teachers when children misbehave in school, they really woke up that morning with the idea in mind of torturing us, but really and truly they didn't. But sometimes as teachers we become frustrated with the student's misbehavior, so by the time we get to the parent, we've forgotten how to communicate. What we want to do is unload on parents, and that is never effective. I can tell you, parents don't want to hear bad things about their children. How many of you have children in school yet? Nobody? Huh? Oh, yeah. How old?
I have 4 kids. So I have one in middle school, one in intermediate, and 2 in elementary.
It's a different feeling having kids in school, isn't it?
My son's taller than I am.
Well, of course, it's always frightening when your children can do things all of a sudden you didn't think they could do. I remember one of my children was about 9 or 10 years old, and we had a fly in the kitchen. And you know, if you miss them the first time you swat, you know they get stirred up and you can't ever catch them. So I saw Lamar go for the fly swatter, and I said, "Give that fly swatter to me, Lamar." And he went bam, and he had swatted that fly before I could even reach for this fly swatter. And I realized, of course, that his reflexes at 9 or 10 were already much faster than mine. So that is intimidating. But undoubtedly, if you have 4 children, are they all in school?
Yes.
If you have 4 children, you've gotten some call from the teacher at some time you would have just as soon not gotten. If you haven't, say your prayers tonight. It'll probably come tomorrow. But in any event, it's intimidating for the school to call and say there's something wrong with your child and we need to talk to you. I got many of those calls. I had two little boys, and they both escaped the American educational system, I'm happy to say, and learned to read, which was a great relief to me. But in the meantime, I did have some parent-teacher conferences, and on a couple of occasions I could tell that the parents were frustrated. And they didn't really want to problem solve. What they really wanted to do was complain because one of the boys was not following the instructions or doing what they were supposed to do. If your problem is frustration with the child, tell your cat or your dog, because the parent doesn't want to hear it. If you have a parent conference, what you need to be doing is, first of all, finding out what they know that may be contributing to this problem. So the first step in effective communication is making certain that you're an active listener and a good listener, and you are communicating, because communication isn't the act of telling somebody how it is. Communication is a sharing of information. And to participate in the communication process, you have to be willing to listen, and you have to be enthusiastic to receive information that someone else has to offer. So step 1 in effective communication is active listening. Step 2 is depersonalizing a situation. You cannot expect parents to respond well when you deliver negative indictments about their children. People don't like to hear those kinds of things about their children. So if you are having or believe that the child is having a problem with something, the question is, how can you report that objectively to the parent and propose a plan to do something about it? It's extremely important, if you have a problem, to propose a solution. It doesn't do any good to tell a parent, your child isn't listening. What can they do about it? You're standing 5 feet away and you can't make the child listen. What are they supposed to do about the child not listening at their job at the bank? Nothing. I had this happen to me one time. I had it happen to me several times. In kindergarten, in 1st grade, my older child, thank God he was real smart. He never would have gotten out of high school because I don't think he ever listened to a word they said. But his kindergarten teacher told me he didn't listen. His 1st grade teacher told me he didn't listen. And so by the time it got to the 2nd grade teacher, I had a pretty clear notion of the fact that he didn't listen. So the 2nd grade teacher called me and she said, your child doesn't listen. I said, yeah, I know it. It's tough. She said, what I'm telling you is that when, Lamar doesn't listen. I said, hey, I know. I'm sorry for you. He doesn't listen to me sometimes either. I know how you feel. She said, you're missing my point. I said, no, I'm not missing your point. I hear you. I hear you. She said, well, he doesn't listen and he doesn't follow directions. And I said, I know it. I'm aware of that. What do you think we should do about it? Well, of course, what she wanted to do about it was referring to special ed, and I said, well, I don't think so. I want to help you, but you're not going to put my straight-A kid in special ed yet. So I went home and I felt bad about that, and so I developed a proposal. And Lamar he'd do anything for rewards. Very materialistic, my children, I must say. They probably got it from their mother, I don't know. But in any event, it was made for good bribery, let me tell you that. Hope your children are materialistic. You've always got the hammer if they want something. So I knew all the things he liked to do, like have friends over and go to Showbiz Pizza and get pocket cars, and I had all these things. So I made charts and this and that, and I made little good behavior cards and follow directions and listen and follow directions, check sheets, and I made this so easy. Anyone could have followed this. And I made an appointment with the teacher, and I went back and I said, I've been thinking about the fact that, my child is not listening and following instructions, and I want to do something to help. Well, she looked down her nose at me, and I said, I have this, I had all these gold and silver and green stars. As kids, I don't know. It is a divine intervention. It's a gift from God. Children love stickers. I can't tell you why anybody would like a sticker. It makes no sense that anybody would like a sticker, but kids love stickers. So I had star stickers. I said, if you will just let me know on the days he listens and follows directions, I will make sure by putting a sticker on here, he can bring this home, and we'll put a sticker on his chart. When he gets so many stickers, he can have a friend spend the night, and when he gets so many more, we can go to Showbiz Pizza, and when we get so many more, we can go to the Astrodome and see the whatever it is now. It was the Astrodome then, should still be the Astrodome in my view, but that's a subject for another day. In any event, I'd take him to a baseball game. You know what she said? She said, I don't have time to do this. I've got 28 kids in this room. And I said, okay, thank you very much. And I went home and I tucked him in bed that night. He said, I don't think that teacher likes me very much. And I said, no, she doesn't. And let me tell you something. I don't like her very much either. And all we can do is hope for better luck next year. Suck it up and make it till the end of the year, and maybe we'll have better luck next year. And next year we got a third grade teacher who thought little boys were lots of fun and thought this was the most amusing child she had ever seen, and was not particularly bothered by the fact that he didn't listen and pay attention, and somehow he made straight A's that whole year. Well, what I want you to encourage you to be is not the teacher who does what parents tell you to do, because the chances are that most of your parents are not going to have a PhD in teacher education. What I want you to be is the teacher who has some suggestions or goals to offer when you invite a parent to come in to communicate. Communication doesn't involve telling the parent what's wrong and griping about the kid and sending them home to do something about it. About the only choice they have is to punish the child, and punishment doesn't work very well in these or other matters. So what I want to encourage you to do is think about what the child's problem is. Schedule a conference with the parent. Ask the parent if they are aware of this problem, or they know where this problem came from, or if the child has had this problem before, if they know of any successful strategies that other teachers have used, if they would be willing to work with you on the problem. Don't complain about their child or gripe about their child or take the child's problem personally. Devise a goal for this child and a suggestion about how it might work. See if the parent approves of this intervention, could possibly help at home by rewarding the child, or when he does something good. It's much better. You'll have much better relations if you call a parent when a child is doing something good than if you call a parent when a child is doing something bad. How many times has the school called you to tell you how wonderful your kids are?
I think my kids are a little odd. 3 or 4 of them are in the gifted and talented program. So when they were bored and weren't paying attention, instead of suggesting special education, they were tested and discovered that they were bored. They were not paying attention because they were bored with the curriculum.
Well, I think my kids were bored with the curriculum, whether they were gifted or talented or not. You know, this child who I was talking about was ultimately in the gifted program, but I really just think he was more motivated to play soccer than he was to do schoolwork. Some of you may remember being that way. How many of you could but you wouldn't? Am I the only one? Yeah, see, I was that same way too. I wasn't very motivated to do well in school. Nearly drove my poor mother crazy. She was a straight A student, and it was very, very, very important to her. But it was just never really important to me. So, you know, I could relate to my children. Probably acorns don't fall very far from the tree. You know, it's probably poetic justice. My mother used to tell me that anyway. Wait till you have children of your own. So you may be a person who's fortunate enough to have children who go through the educational system and never miss a beat. And you will certainly have students in your classrooms who fit this category. But those are not the kids you'll worry about. The children you'll worry about, and the children that will aggravate you to a certain extent, are children who are not marching in step and not singing on key. And you will need to talk to their parents to get suggestions. But at the same time you're getting suggestions, you also need to remember to tell them good things about their children. That very same year my older child had this experience in school. I went to a party with for the younger child, and his first grade teacher, who had gotten both of these kids changed schools at midterm, the first grade teacher looked at me and said, "Oh, you're Pike's mother. I'm so glad to have Pike in my room." And of course I believed her. Then about 2 years later I still remember this lady's name. As far as I'm concerned, she probably ought to be sainted. About 2 years later, I thought, yeah, right. Getting a kid in midterm in the middle of the first grade who came from another country, I bet she was tickled pink, don't you? But of course, that never dawned on me. I just loved the teacher because she had something nice to say about my child. And you'll find that it works magic, and that it's part of communication is making people feel good about their children and feel that you are an advocate for their children rather than you personalize the problems that their children are having in school. When you determine that a child can't keep up or is having difficulty or is not behaving properly, and determine that you need to do an intervention, such as the little child we were talking about earlier, you were the second grade teacher and the child couldn't read on level, what you find is that things are not working in your classroom the way they are, right? You've got to do something differently because things aren't working for this student. And when this is the case, you will find that you need to do an intervention of some sort. By intervention, what we mean is that the school assignments and teaching experiences and methods and materials that we're using for one reason or another are not resulting in some children learning what it is that we desire for them to learn. And so we're going to want to do something different for that child, and it's great if you can think of things to do on your own. You may be able to look at your classroom and see that you can manipulate certain aspects of the curriculum or the methods that you use in teaching, or manipulate the environment in some way to increase the probability that a child is successful. On the other hand, you may find that you really have done all the things you can think of and you don't know what to do next. And in this case, you will probably find yourself in a school where there is a pre-referral intervention team. At least that's what your book calls it, pre-referral intervention team. We'll talk in a minute about some other nomenclature to use for that might be more appropriate. But in any event, a pre-referral intervention team is a group of people that meets when a child is having difficulty in meeting the expectations in the general ed classroom. And the purpose of their meeting is to determine what kinds of appropriate educational interventions might be made that can assist this child in meeting the needs of the classroom without being referred to special ed. Oftentimes someone will come in and observe the child. There may be some testing on the learning styles that will be helpful to you or whatever. But in any event, if you find that you need to do this, you will need to make a formal request for intervention assistance. And this request can not only be made by you, it can be made by a parent, a teacher, some other specialist or administrator in the school. But the purpose is to get people together to talk about what we can do for this student to provide assistance before they have to be sent to special education. I don't like the term pre-referral intervention. The whole purpose of intervention assistance is to make modifications in the curriculum so that the child won't end up having to have a special education label. What we're trying to do with intervention assistance is restructure the classroom environment in some way so that the child is successful, because we know if he's not successful in the general ed classroom with whatever modifications we can make for him, he will have to be sent for testing. He will have to be tested, diagnosed, labeled, and then probably returned to us to have modifications made in the general ed classroom, right? So this is the notion of really going around your elbow to get back to your thumb. So I hate the notion of pre-referral intervention, because what it implies to the teacher in my mind is, okay, you've got to go through these hoops and then you can send this child on to special ed. And of course the whole notion of intervention assistance is to make changes in the educational environment so the child doesn't have to be diagnosed and labeled and sent for special ed, if you follow me on that. So I much prefer the term intervention assistance. I had a doctoral student about 2 or 3 years ago who did her dissertation on intervention assistance, which in HISD at that time was called pre-referral intervention. And she was an employee in that district, so she used that district for her subjects. And what she found, and we reviewed all of the children who had been referred for special ed placement that year. Every child was required to have a pre-referral intervention before the student was tested and placed in special ed. Guess what she found? Every single child who was referred for pre-referral intervention, guess where they eventually ended up? They eventually ended up in special education. So we went back and looked at these modifications that were done for these kids to see, you know, what the teachers were doing, how they felt about it, what they found out. Guess what? Even if they thought the interventions were effective, they sent the kids to special ed anyway. Well, I started thinking about it. I thought it no wonder. We call them pre-referral interventions, indicating that as soon as we get these interventions done, we're going to go on with the referral. So more and more people are changing the terminology to reflect not pre-referral interventions, but intervention assistance. The notion that if we make accommodations in a general ed classroom, we can often create an environment in which students can be effective and successful, and they don't have to be referred on for special education. So that's an important part of the special ed process, particularly for you as general ed teachers, because you are going to have children who are not going to be able to keep up. Even if you're a really great teacher, there are going to be some kids who have something that they need other than what you can give them. Yes?
Can we get the red writing part back out?
Not right now. I don't know how. Can we get the red writing part back up? Can you go to the transfer? There you go. Very good. I don't.
Make a deal. I'll leave that up if you use the microphones. I haven't been quite religious about that either.
I know it. You're bad.
So find religion, use the microphones, and
You don't have to take that personally. Nobody else has used the microphones either. It's hard to remember. I know you feel foolish when you do. I sympathize with you. I feel foolish, wired like Barbara Walters myself, but nevertheless, I guess it's necessary. With regard to the red, these are things that are important. But the important thing is not that you write down every single word. We're not going to be able, you know, to stay on every slide until you write down every single word. The important part is that you get the concept. And the concept with this is really easy. You know, the concept is that intervention assistance is a much better word than pre-referral intervention, even though your book uses the terminology pre-referral intervention. And the reason it's better is because when you do accommodations for your kids in the general ed setting, what you want to do is make them successful in the general ed setting. You don't want to just provide documentation so that you can justify sending them to special ed for a label. Does that make sense to you? That will be characteristic of most of the things in the red. I just put the red in this PowerPoint presentation this semester, and the reason why I did is not really so you can write it down verbatim. It's to remind myself that I want to tell you about this thing that I think is important, even though it's not in your textbook. And I want you to listen, because I think there's a lot about special ed that is not in a textbook. You know, the textbook gives you the party line. Maybe that's why textbooks are kind of boring, you know. They just give you the party line. I like to spice it up with a little bit of controversy. So that's all. And I want to reward you if you come to class and listen. That ought to be worth something, shouldn't it? I think people learn something just by listening to one another and talking with one another and sharing with one another. And I don't think our system of assessment is so 100% foolproof accurate that the difference between an 89 on my test and a 90 on my test may distinguish the better teacher from the one who's not quite as good. So I do think that things accrue to people who have repeated exposure to information, and that coming to class is important and being with your colleagues is important, and you ought to get something extra for that. And your grade ought to reflect your willingness to go to that extra effort. So that's really the purpose of the part that's in red. In any event, when we decide on intervention assistance, one of the things that we need to do is to determine how long we're going to give this intervention to work. How long do you think it would take to determine? Let's say you had a student and you found like you had one like mine, little boy, who's this big now. Say you had one like him that didn't listen and didn't follow directions. What do you think you might do about that?
He's still getting all A's.
Huh?
He's still getting all A's.
Yeah, but he would drive you crazy because when he's not listening to you, what's he doing? Yeah, he's probably off task or out of his seat or doing something else you would find objectionable. Yeah, he was getting all A's right then. At that point, yeah, he was. But it will still bother you when you're the teacher. You feel like they ought to listen. And the truth is, they may be distracting somebody who's not getting all A's, and they may be talking while you're talking. You know, as teachers, I'd say this jokingly, you can't take every single thing I say to heart. But, you know, as teachers, we're pretty happy for kids to fail as long as they fail silently. It's when they start making an uproar about failing that it really bothers us. And most children who are failing in school are not very cooperative and they're not very well behaved because they're trying out different coping strategies to have their needs met. Failing in school is not giving them the positive confirmation about themselves that it takes for them to feel good, so they're trying with different strategies, most of which you will find disruptive and antisocial. So say you just have a kid that's off task. He doesn't listen, he doesn't follow directions, and my voice is ringing in your ear. You don't want to refer him for an attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So what else might you do you think?
You made the student to participate in the class.
Huh? All right, she's got an idea.
You made the student to participate in class, like ask him if you had to read some questions, you ask the student, can you read the question for me? So when the child is participating, he's not doing nothing else.
Okay, so you're going to involve him directly in the class. Okay, so we've got one intervention. You might move him up close to your desk so you can determine when he's not paying attention and when he's off task. And when you notice he's off task, rather than saying, you're not paying attention, you would say, could you read question 3 for me? Or could you pick up the papers? Or have you finished your work? Or you would re-involve him in what's going on. Who else has another idea about something we might do for this third grader who is not paying attention? Yes, he has an idea. What might you do?
Make him come up with a lesson plan.
Make him plan the lesson.
Straight up.
That's not a bad idea. Another thing you could do along that line is you could say, tomorrow we're going to have to do spelling. Everyone who knows how to spell the words on the pretest is going to get to write a creative story while the others learn to spell the words. As soon as you learn to spell all the words, you can write a creative story. So you could tell this child not necessarily to teach the lesson, but you could tell him, can you come up with a subject for our creative
Make him come up for the whole class.
lesson? Or you could assign him to teach. Would you like to be the teacher? You could involve him with teaching, give him personal responsibility, huh?
I wouldn't go that far.
Well, it might be a great idea. It might not work. Some children who are not on task are not good peer tutors, but others might be. Huh?
Case sensitive, I guess. Case sensitive. varies from child to child.
Right. Oh, yes. It can vary from child to child, as can everything. It's awfully difficult to come up with a strategy that will work with an imaginary child, because we don't know what who that child is and what he's likely to respond to. But say you had a strategy and you had a strategy, and there could be other strategies as well. You could reinforce him for paying attention. You could say to him before the beginning of the day, I want you to work really hard on paying attention today and staying on task. I'm going to give you a reminder for being on task. Some of your kids who are off task may not get their work done. And so you might have one of those children and say, I'm going to we're going to have a secret signal. I'm going to signal you when you get back off task. And if you get your work done today, you will get a reward of one kind or another. There are as many interventions that we could come up with as there are students in here. You know, everybody could come up with a different intervention. Yours might be right or mine might be right. How would we know if the intervention was right? How would we know if the intervention was the right one?
When they start showing improvement.
If the kid starts listening and paying attention, we were a genius. So are we going to go on with that intervention till May? Maybe yes, maybe no. What would be the determining factor in whether we would continue with this intervention till May? Whether or not it's working. So one of the things we would need to do in establishing an intervention is to establish a timeline. How long are we going to give this intervention to see if it works? Maybe we'll give it a month or 6 weeks. Probably 6 weeks is too long. If it's not doing some good in a month, you probably need to come up with another plan to get him involved. But your intervention needs to be positive, and it needs to be proactive, and it needs to be evaluated according to a timeline. These intervention strategies I mentioned earlier can take one of several forms. You can alter the curriculum in some way. When I say I think we can alter the curriculum, how would you alter curriculum? How could you alter curriculum for somebody?
Make it something that they're really interested in.
You could make it something they're interested in and give it a motivational component. What if the student can't hear? You might have a student record the curriculum so they or write the curriculum out so they can read it if they have difficulty hearing. You could modify the curriculum by having that student do fewer words or different spelling words. The IEP may call for that child to actually do different spelling words. But there are an infinite number of ways we can change the curriculum for students. Possibly this would increase the probability that they're successful.
And I also feel that a good teacher is a good teacher when he's dealing with the challenged kids. But if the teacher wants to deal only with the straight A kids, I don't think that makes it a good teacher.
You can't ever make yourself a good teacher by failing kids.
Because most of the teachers, they just want to have a straight A's and do not worry about the kids that are having problems.
Well, I don't know that most teachers do that. I'll tell you what I think happens to most teachers, most really good teachers. I think most really good teachers teach really good, creative, effective lessons. But they have a tendency to do what I call, and I alluded to it last week, and that is assess and progress. Remember when we were talking about the lesson plan cycle last week? And that you had to look in your guided and independent practice to see who's getting it and who's not getting it? What I find is really good teachers can teach most of the kids in their classroom, and most of the kids get it, and have fun getting it and think it's wonderful and love their teacher and move on. But when a teacher is a really good teacher and almost all her kids get it, the tendency when a child doesn't get it is to say, "What's wrong with that kid? There can't be anything wrong with my lesson. Almost everybody gets it but you." It's the wonderful teacher who looks at you and says, "Well, I had a really good lesson, but you didn't get it, so it wasn't a really good lesson for you. Maybe if I did this for you, you would get it too." And that's what I see happening. I don't think it's that really good teachers don't care about the kids that are falling behind. I think they drive really good teachers crazy. I just think that most teachers who are teaching today receive their education at a time when it was perfectly permissible for a couple of kids to fall behind and take those kids out, send them to special ed, and not worry about them anymore. And what we know now is that what we have in school is not throwaway kids. You know, we have a group of kids with a wide range of individual differences, and we're never going to solve their problems without responding to these individual differences. We'll spend a lot of time next week talking about how we determine the difference between an individual difference and a disability. It's a tough question. I really can't sing. I mean, I'm so bad. My own mother wouldn't let me sing at church. That's the truth. Hush, hush, you're off key. She couldn't sing all that good either. She just didn't know it. But I'm a really bad singer. I know you don't have any patience with this. Plays the piano by ear and does all that magic stuff. But I can't sing. Am I singing disabled? I'm really bad at it. I could be singing disabled. If you sent me to the Juilliard School of Music, I'd definitely be singing disabled. The thing of it is, most kids cannot sing pretty good and get by okay. It's when you can't read pretty good that you have a serious problem in school. And there are lots of kids who sing just fine, but they can't read pretty good. Or they play baseball just fine, and they can't read pretty good. Or they even do mechanical things really, really well, but they can't read too good. And that's when we have a problem. In any event, there are a variety of venues for making educational and instructional accommodations. One is our instructional procedures. How do we teach them? We might use a different learning style. We might use more hands-on activities. If you have a student who's not learning their spelling words, you might let them cut out sandpaper words, or you might let them do those letters in a sandbox. And use a tactile sense in addition to some of the other strategies. So you can try teaching them a different way. You can do classroom management objectives, motivate them from the standpoint of reinforcement and punishment. Hopefully not punishment, just reinforcement. We'll talk about that when we talk about classroom management. But we can make lots of things worthwhile for kids. How many of you think we shouldn't reward kids in school? If you do, I want your paychecks. The U of H rewards me on the first day of every month for coming up here, and I love y'all, I really do. But when they quit paying me, I'm not coming. Some of y'all probably don't mind coming to this class. A few of you, I hope, don't mind coming. But what if I told you I wasn't going to give you a grade? Not likely. Cute as I am, you probably wouldn't be here, would you? Probably not. Huh? I haven't asked anybody to have anybody asked to audit my class in a long, long time. You're coming because you're getting a grade, aren't you? It's going to be on your transcript, and it's required on your degree plan, and it's going to make you be a teacher, and that's what you want to happen to you. Sometimes we can make those kinds of things worthwhile for children in ways that are meaningful to them, and it greatly increases the probability that they'll do what we want them to do. Huh? Well, it depends on what you give them. In the first place, most of the things that you give them, you can't afford to give them anything that's against the law, really and truly. The things they want, you know, material things they want are too expensive. But there's lots of things. We'll talk about that more when we get in classroom management. But let me suffice it to say that there's a range of accommodations we can make, and our willingness to generate those strategies will depend a great deal on the extent to which we're effective at obviating the necessity of special education for many of these youngsters. Now then, I'm going to take a short break. I'll be right back with you in a few minutes, and we'll finish this chapter and let Kim do her assignment-guided practice and independent practice.